The Ukrainians have, in fact, vastly better than Russia mobilized their entire country. They have done total mobilization. No males were allowed to leave. President Zelensky has been a truly Churchillian leader. Everybody in the country has sought to contribute in some way or other, and innumerable businessmen have hung up their business suits and put on camouflage uniforms, and again, been trained, equipped, organized, and now employed very, very impressively. And the reality is that the Ukrainian military is now larger and more capable than that of Russia on Ukraine, despite Russia pulling forces from virtually everywhere that they could find them, and despite their partial mobilization, which has been positively shambolic by comparison with that of Ukraine. It is producing essentially what could be described as cannon fodder, not effective, capable, well-armed, and well-trained forces. They're being pulled off the streets, essentially required to report to the conscript station. Of course, more Russian men left the country than actually reported as draftees, having had their training many, many years ago in most cases. And they're very quickly sent to the front lines where they just cannot be all that effective. Now, cannon fodder is a problem, especially in urban areas for an enemy, but it is not an insurmountable one. And the Ukrainians, thanks in particular to the extraordinary amount of support from the United States, $18.5 billion worth of arms, ammunition, and other materiel, plus over $13 billion in economic assistance, together with that provided by NATO and other Western countries. They're literally supported by the arsenals of democracy around the world, and they have put this to extraordinarily good use. Several of these items we've provided are true game changers. The guided missile launch rocket system munition, which is a subset of the rockets we've provided for the multiple launch rocket system, these land on a dinner table at 70 kilometers. They're over $100,000 a piece. The same is true of the Excalibur rounds, which is a subset, very small subset of the more than 850,000 heavy artillery rounds that we have provided, 155 millimeter artillery, which also is very, very accurate, also probably around $100,000 a copy, about a third the range of the, or a little bit more of the rockets that I described. These have taken out Russian headquarters, their ammo supply points, their fuel depots, and their major barracks, if there's large concentrations of forces, up to a distance of 70 kilometers, forced the Russians to pull them back that distance, and therefore rendered what was already quite poor logistical support of those on the front lines on the Russian side even worse than it already was. They clearly will clear the area that is west of the Dnipro River, that area down here in the south, in what's called Kherson Oblast. I think they'll make continued gains over in the east, where they liberated all of Kharkiv Oblast, and now they're starting to eat into Luhansk Oblast. And I think they'll start to penetrate more centrally in the south as well over time. The winter will be much tougher for the Russians on the battlefield than it will be for the Ukrainians, who are fighting. This is their war of independence. Their people recognize it as such. They'll welcome soldiers into their home. They'll give them warm soup if they needed a place to get dry and get some sleep if necessary. That is not going to be the case on the other side, where the Russians are occupying territory. The people largely hate them, and some of them are actually trying to kill them. But months and months of very, very tough fighting. On the Russian side, what Putin wants to do is, of course, to outlast, to outsuffer, if you will, the Ukrainians and the Europeans by cutting off the flow of natural gas. That has not worked. The European fill, I was just in London last week. I've been also in Warsaw, as I mentioned, and Berlin before that over the course of the last month and a half. The fill of natural gas capacity, storage capacity, is now well over 92%. The winter so far has been very mild. The Russians cannot reverse this dynamic on the battlefield, where the Ukrainians actually have a larger and more capable force, despite being more than 3 times the size of Ukraine and having incredible energy, mineral, and other commodity blessings. What they can do, however, and have been doing, is punish Ukraine just to take down civilian infrastructure. They've taken out about 40% of Ukraine's energy generation and transmission so far. They're also attacking the water system throughout Ukraine as well. These are not military targets, obviously. This falls into the category of war crimes by most definitions, certainly the Geneva Convention, but it's all they can do, given that they can no longer carry out any kind of sustained offensive on on the battlefield and have been losing again over the course of the past month and a half or 2 months. So the prospects are grim for them. But again, unless they begin to crumble or collapse, which is not impossible, but very, very hard to predict, we will see months of very tough fighting, very tough casualties, noting that the Russians have undoubtedly lost at least 4 times the soldiers in 8 months of combat in Ukraine that they lost in 9 years of combat in a tough war in Afghanistan. But Putin is going to continue. Zelensky cannot negotiate right now. And in fact, the Ukrainians are actually more resolved than ever as a result of these punishing cruise missile and Iranian drone strikes. I think that Ukraine will have taken back that portion of Kherson Oblast, that is to the west of the Dnipro River that essentially dissects, goes from Kyiv all the way down through most of north to south through roughly the center-east part of the country. It could go farther. Some does depend on trafficability and some other intangibles having to do with the weather, which again will be tougher for the Russians, as I noted, than for the Ukrainians, but still will be a limiting factor on the Ukrainian side as well. And then I'd hope to see some additional progress into Luhansk Oblast from Kharkiv, which is the major city, second largest city in Ukraine, in the eastern part of the country, right near the Russian border. And of course, they started the war by winning the battles of Kyiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, and then ultimately, more recently, Kharkiv. And I think there can be continued progress there as well. And somewhere you've got to find a flank, something that is vulnerable, such as they found when the Russians had transferred a lot of the major and the good forces from here down to Kherson, where they knew the offensive was coming, where the Ukrainians have made modest progress, but not yet, again, fully liberated. Eventually, Bob, I think that there will be some grand negotiation eventually, but not coming soon to a theater near you, in which Russia recognizes, or perhaps Putin's successor recognizes the need, the imperative to get out from underneath the financial, economic, and personal sanctions and export controls on Russia, stop the terrible bleeding and casualties in Ukraine, maybe negotiate what they might retain, something, again, Zelensky can't allow at all right now. And on our side, we say, look, and there's going to be a Marshall Plan and there's a durable security guarantee, which I think has to be part of the ultimate formula, whether you can actually guarantee NATO membership or not, given the possibility that Hungary or Turkey might object to that. And it takes all NATO members. And by the way, those two have not yet voted yes on Sweden and Finland, although I think that they will in those cases. All other countries have. So I think over time, you can see some kind of negotiation in support of Ukraine. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine is the adage of the administration, which I think has done a very impressive job on support of Ukraine and galvanizing the rest of the world around this and around sanctions, and continuing to pick away at various elements and various supply chains of the major industries of Russia, starting with, of course, the defense industry, which has been crippled by the export controls on microchips and actually led reportedly Russia to buy washing machines so they could take the microchips out of them and use them in their arms development, which strikes me as a very, very inefficient way to run a military industrial complex. So I think that's how this will shape out, at least at this vantage. Noting again that I reserve the right to revisit this if you see Russian forces start to crumble, maybe even collapse locally, which is something that cannot be ruled out given the state of morale on the Russian side, certainly very much relative to that on the Ukrainian side, which again is fighting for its very survival, and as I said, its war of independence.